Welcome to Great in the Sack When Misogyny Leads to Mayhem. I'm your host, Nicole Davenport. It's a Friday afternoon on the sprawling campus of Ohio State University. The kind of day when the sun illuminates the windows of each of the buildings and students can be found lounging on the green, the heavy anticipation of weekend plans hanging in the air, thick like tension. A group of sorority sisters huddle near their house, phones in hand, comparing notes about that night's biggest party. A pair of roommates grab some iced lattes from the student center, complaining loudly about midterms. The usual. A day like any other. And then, at first, one might think, what was that? A car backfiring? Construction noise? The accidental drop of a skateboard against the pavement? But the sound repeats. Again and again. Sharp, unforgiving, slicing through the air. Panic spreads like a current in an open body of water. Screams splinter the chatter into fragments. Someone yells, and suddenly bodies are scattering, rushing for cover behind the benches, cars, doorways, anywhere they can. People drop to the ground, some ducking in confusion, others trying to cover themselves with their hands and their backpacks. Through the thick chaos, a figure emerges. Focused, deliberate, weapon in hand. For a moment, eye contact is made with a student who is frozen in place, books clutched to their chest, staring at a face that isn't even angry, just disturbingly vacant, as he begins to draw the weapon again. But then there's only silence. This is just a look of what could have been. A large attack with a so-called kill count of around 3,000 women. But alas, no lives were lost that day. No parents received calls that would shatter their entire being. The sorority house wasn't turned into a memorial. The sidewalks were not scattered with evidence markers and flags. Because in March 2020, law enforcement intervened just in time. They found a young man in his bedroom. His weapons, his journals, his manifesto, detailing every brutal intention. His name is Tres Genko, and what could have been a very bloody day of devastation was cut off before it could even happen. But what brings someone to this moment of committal? What makes a person believe that violence could be the answer to their isolation? Today, we explore the twisted path of Elliot Roger fanboy Tres Genko, the dark allure of incel ideology, and how we as people and as a society can better address the problem of unwanted celibacy in men. Tres Genko's story is a story about law enforcement intervention. It's also a reflection of these now brightly lit corners of the internet in the ideologies of the self-proclaimed incels who see violence as retribution for rejection and being unwantedly celibate. You can find the show sources and also the social medias on Podbean and also on Spotify and pretty much anywhere else you get your podcasts. In the last episode, we discussed a case out of Turkey in which a 19-year-old man, Semih Çelik, murdered two 19-year-old women, Aysenur Halil and Iqbal Uzuner, within 30 minutes of each other. I learned the case up one side and down the other, but I found it difficult to differentiate exactly what it may have been that caused Semih to go to such extremes. As a child, Semih was said to be just fine by his family. However, as we often see with cases similar to this, as Semih hit his teen years, things began to change. Authorities relayed that he had been involved in at least one incel group online. a type of manifesto video was found a short while after the crimes were committed. There were what some referred to as, quote, satanic drawings found in his room. Turkey's democratic backsliding had been occurring throughout Sami's life, shrinking women's place in society down to a small portion of what it had been around the time he was born. The purpose of this episode is to dive deeper into the very uncomfortable ideology of the involuntary celibate, without the immediate tragedy of a victim's loss overshadowing the conversation. If you've ever thought, man, I would love to understand what Inceldom even is, then you're in the right place. We will explore the why and how radicalization can occur within this toxic little smoking section of the manosphere. The reality is, of course, that not every self-identified incel picks up a weapon, but it is fair to say that men who are unwantedly celibate have a higher chance of having a hatred towards women, hence making it a little easier for them to become radicalized. While most of them won't pick up a weapon, as I said, does that make the ideology any less dangerous? Involuntary celibates, or incels, represent a subculture of predominantly heterosexual men who struggle to form romantic or sexual relationships. In 1997, Canadian woman, yes, you heard me right, woman in her mid-20s named Alana, created a web page where people having dating troubles could congregate and find comfort in one another, even community. She called it Alana's Involuntary Celibacy Project. This seemed to be a very safe, healthy place to be for men and women, aside from an angry misogynistic viewpoint every now and again. Alana had coined the term Incel, Incel, which was shortened over time to incel, especially due to its strange pronunciation. Sometime after she moved on, and kind of forgot about it to be honest, the idea behind her website transgressed into the vile type of places that they are today. Alana tries to counteract these platforms now, in the present time, with another project that she has created, which is called Love, Not Anger, to try to promote healthy conversations about singlehood. While often viewed as a fringe group, Inceldom can be understood as an extension of patriarchal norms and expectations. The patriarchy establishes rigid gender roles, positioning men as dominant and entitled to women's affection and their bodies. When these societal promises remain unfulfilled, some men experience frustration and resentment, leading to the development of the more toxic incel communities. An analysis done by Alex DeBranco highlights that incels' grievances are rooted in male supremacist ideologies, reflecting broader patriarchal attitudes. William Costello's research, on the other hand, provides insight into the psychological profiles of incels and also of evolutionary psychology. His studies reveal that incels often have a lower self-perceived mate value and feel external forces control their single status. This aligns with parental investment theory, which suggests that because women typically invest more in their offspring, they are more selective in mate choice. Incels may misinterpret this selectivity as personal rejection, exacerbating feelings of their inadequacy. It also seems as though some incels use evolutionary psychology as means for justifying their hateful rhetoric. In summary, and in my opinion, inceldom can be seen as a manifestation of patriarchal structures where unmet societal expectations of male entitlement lead to misogynistic subcultures. Recognizing the interplay of evolutionary psychology and mental health is also essential in addressing the root causes without condoning harmful behaviors. Now, with all that being said, the incel community is a subsection of the manosphere, as we discussed in part 1. The other main areas are MRAs, which are men's right activists, PUAs, which are pickup artists, and MGTOWs, men going their own way, which all exist in the margins of the internet. These men are finding their way to forums and chat rooms all over the internet, to name a few places. The virtual areas where incels like to chat are often an echo chamber of bitterness, resentment, and entitlement, where men bond over their perceived rejection by women. In fact, they blame women completely for denying them what they feel is their God given right as men, claiming that it is life altering in the worst way. However, the word bond is a bit of an overstatement. They're not often kind to each other. If someone is trying to reason or use sense, they're often made fun of for not accepting what some incels feel is reality. And that reality is that the cards are stacked against them. You see, the world, according to incels, is built on lies. And to understand their doctrine, you have to understand their version of quote unquote truth. You know the movie The Matrix, right? Well, the incel ideology is kind of borrowed from it to an extent. You see, it starts with the blue pill, the blissful ignorance of the average man. Blue pilled men believe in fairy tales, that love is a matter of personality, that hard work leads to success, and that attraction isn't dictated by cold evolutionary hierarchies, no. In other words, they're normies, blind to the brutal biological determinism incels claim governs human attraction. Then there's the red pill, a supposed awakening. Red pilled men fancy themselves as enlightened cynics, rejecting mainstream narratives in favor of a hyper masculine worldview. They believe foids, which is short for femoids, a derogatory, bastardized name for women, only desire power, status, and genetic superiority. Red pillars see themselves as realists, but they are merely traditionalists railing against feminism and quote unquote weak men who still play by society's rules. And finally, there's the black pill. This is where Inceldom festers like a rotted wound, where self pity turns into comfy, self righteous nihilism, and where hopelessness curdles into absolute rage. Men who have taken the black pill believe that attraction is hardwired and that they're biologically doomed to be unwanted. No self improvement or social maneuvering, nothing will ever change their fate. And since the game is rigged, why not burn the whole system down, right? Here's how the pipeline seems to go. First, you sleepwalk through life as a blue pilled clown. Then you wake up red pilled and angry. Finally, you may move on to the black pill, where the only options left are despair, withdrawal, or complete destruction, be it to oneself or to others. Inside the workings of the incel cosmology, the world is ruled by Chads and Stacys, the untouchable elite of the dating world. A Chad is everything an incel will never be. He is tall, square jawed, blessed with perfect genetics. All this talk is giving eugenic vibes, to be honest, but anyway, he doesn't need to try. He just exists in a world where women throw themselves at his feet and doors open effortlessly, where confidence is a given, not something clawed at through the years of rejection. To incels, Chad is both a villain and an aspiration, the ultimate proof that attraction is predetermined. And then there's Stacy, the high-heeled, giggling, Instagram-filtered embodiment of female shallowness. When I think of what they mean by a Stacy, I think of the mean girls that I went to school with. But to me, that was like a classist thing. In my family, we didn't have an overabundance of money, so I wasn't on that same level, not able to join the same type of programs. Now that I'm older, I can see that we're all largely products of our environment, our upbringing. Girls followed the magical guidelines of magazines like 17 and Teen Beat when I was a kid, as I believe I've said before, just trying to fit in. That was the 90s, though, anyway. That being said, in incel mythology, the Stacy is beautiful but vapid, Powerful but undeserving. She only wants Chad. She will never look twice at an incel. She exists only to reject, to humiliate, and to remind them of everything that they'll never have. It is a little bit childish, a little black and white thinking, but many incels are young men with no life experience, and the others, I mean, let's be real. You have to admit, it is a huge part of life to meet someone and mate with them. Now that we know who the Chads and the Stacys are, bear with me here. We can learn about the 80-20 rule. Buckle up. The 80-20 rule in incel ideology is a distorted interpretation of Pareto's principle applied to dating. Incels believe that 80% of women are only interested in the top 20% of men, the Chads, leaving the remaining 80% of men to compete for the attention of the leftover 20% of women. This fuels the incel belief that most men are doomed to be involuntarily celibate due to a rigid dating market where attractiveness and status dictate all romantic success. And you know what? I'm sure that might even seem accurate when using dating sites because of their inherently toxic methods to keep you on the site, even though they swear otherwise. The reality is, however, that Chads and Stacys are just phantoms, straw men built to justify resentment. They're the product of a belief system designed to remove all sense of responsibility for one's own choices and also one's own happiness. Because if you're doomed from birth, you don't even have to try, right? You can feel nice and comfortable in the idea that it's someone else's fault. Now, I'm talking about the extreme incels that are committing violence. I'm not talking about people who identify as being unwantedly celibate. But imagine adopting such an ideology where you don't have to grow and you don't have to question whether the real problem isn't the world, but maybe it's the way you view it. So, just like on the dating sites, you stay right there in the same place. And isn't that what any website or influencer or even guru really wants? Your time, your money, your dedication to the cause. And rejection is something that every one of us have experienced, am I right? The sting of it, the burn of being dismissed, overlooked, or even worse, ignored entirely. I remember the quiet and sometimes not so quiet humiliation of my early teen years. The way I wanted so badly to be seen, not in some grand melodramatic way, but just acknowledged. It's hard to understand how incels see our experiences as so radically different. Like we, women, girls, anyone who's ever felt the sharp pang of exclusion, haven't lived through rejection as well. Like they've cornered the market on loneliness. But there's something else at play here, it seems. Because not everyone who feels invisible turns to hate or finds solace in doctrine or blame. So, what pushes them further? What primes them for radicalization? Look into the forums, their manifestos, and you'll see a pattern. Autism, disabilities, mental illness, vulnerable narcissism, and a lot of bullying in early school years. Studies and articles link these traits again and again to inceldom, not because these conditions cause it, but because society's treatment of difference isolates them further sometimes. They grow up being called weird, struggling to connect, misreading social cues, or being outright mocked for who they are. And in a world that already tells them that they're less than, the incel community hands them a brand new identity, one that is already built up and ready to go, soaked in self-pity and rage. Would those associated with incel platforms and forums who commit horrendous crimes have committed the crimes if they hadn't been? Now, while many incels struggle with mental health issues, acknowledging this should not excuse violent, misogynistic behavior. Understanding the psychological challenges faced by incels is crucial for developing interventions, but it's equally important to hold individuals accountable for harmful actions and beliefs that pave the way to violence. And while I agree that patterns can be found, I personally feel that focusing on mental health issues treats loneliness and depression as the primary drivers of incel violence, rather than addressing the underlying misogyny and sense of male entitlement. DeBronco emphasizes that while mental health challenges may be present, they don't inherently lead to violent behavior. Instead, it is the entitlement and the jacked up moral justification that animate perpetrators of mass violence, who are more often than not cisgender, heterosexual white men. There are studies, however, now that reveal incels of different political backgrounds and ethnicities. For example, take a look at attempted murderer and self-processed incel Armando Hernandez Jr. of the Phoenix, Arizona Westgate shopping center shooting, which he streamed live onto Snapchat. Armando was more on the far left, also believing that COVID was a government conspiracy, another extreme behavior. The dominant voices in these spaces, as well as the most high profile acts of incel related violence, though, have largely emerged from the straight white dude demographic. It has also been reported that some incels have undergone therapy but retained their misogynistic ideology, returning to online communities that reinforce those beliefs. DeBronco notes that mental health services are not designed to treat ideology, as misogyny and supremacism are not mental health issues. Therefore, solely providing mental health support without addressing the ideological components may be insufficient. Also, there's the chance that emphasizing mental health as a primary factor in incel behavior can inadvertently stigmatize individuals with psychological conditions. Advocacy groups have spoken out against attributing violent actions to mental health diagnosis, as this can lead to harmful generalizations and misunderstandings about mental illness. And that I can totally get on board with. I have spoken to a few different people about the somewhat culty relationship that goes on within these incel groups. And while they may not have a typical leader as most cults do, the more violent variety of incels kinda do. And that would be Incel Saint Elliot Rogers, as they call him. Then I think, look how many normal, healthy people looking for some more meaning in their life get sucked into cults and do horrendous things that they wouldn't have done otherwise. So I don't think the cultiness of this subculture can be ignored. There are so many factors when thinking about extreme behavior and what leads up to it. I do feel it's important to understand why. As a society, we have to try to be open about learning and discussing these uncomfortable things. Otherwise, they just get pushed further under the rug. I could go back and forth on this all day. I recently read someone saying that journalists and people alike should try to motivate themselves to approach situations with curiosity and empathy, which I agree with, and is the reason for this part 2 episode. After all, the people most in danger when it comes to incels is themselves, according to studies revolving around those who are unwantedly celibate and choose self-exit. It seems that people who identify as involuntarily celibate don't understand the current dating market, or at least maybe the nuances of it. And I have to say, if they're going on these dating sites that are known to be toxic, I mean, studies done from these dating sites indicate that excessive swiping is very bad for mental health. And think about the fact that it wasn't that long ago that marriage prospects were handled by family. I mean, I guess it's been a couple hundred years, varying from country to country. There has been such a shift, in fact, that it seems that some can't keep up. Some people may even go so far as to say that incels are a marginalized group due to extremely high rates of self exit and self hatred, but I digress. No matter what you believe, the fact that most people who identify as involuntarily celibate are not violent makes me feel that most are deserving of some empathy because, hey, not all incels. Inceldom does not always seem to be about wanting companionship specifically, but rather it seems to be about being denied it and it seems to be more about the inherently misogynistic entitlement to it. It's about believing that they are being excluded from society and all of its splendors, and that's not fair. And this could be for a number of reasons because they're socially awkward, or they feel that their looks are not enough, because they're short or neurodivergent, even. They feel that rejection isn't just unfortunate and tragic, but it's an injustice, a crime. And it is possible that very bad things can happen when convincing an already vulnerable mind that the world is against them. By vulnerable, I also mean young and inexperienced. This inexperience is being taken advantage of by so called manfluencers like Andrew Tate and the likes of Jordan Peterson. So, as I said, most incels do nothing, many of which happen to be steered to these parts of the internet by a simple search about dating women. Others might stew for some time in resentment. A few others, however, decide to fight back. And that's when the ideology and this, in my opinion, is when the ideology becomes harmful. This extreme way of thinking that simultaneously snuffs out any hope for the future crosses over into the real world and into real world consequences. At its most extreme, Inceldom has an underlying ideology that some live like it is their entire personality, their entire life, their entire life. It warps that loneliness and jealousy at the unfairness into rage, and that rage into justification for violence. Let me reiterate, as not to be an alarmist, that acts of extreme violence from this group are rare compared to how many people identify with unwanted celibacy. Those who never act on their violent fantasies still fuel the ecosystem, however, in these areas of the internet, validating each other's grievances with more hate, cheering on the ones who cross the line from anonymous hatred to real life, the way that Tres Genko did in his thousands of visits to incel platforms and forums. He idolized mass murderer and whiny, self-proclaimed incel Elliot Rodger. Ah, Elliot Rodger, who gave himself the dorky title of the, quote, Supreme Gentleman, patron saint of the painfully forsaken, martyr of that miserable friend zone. Also, a somewhat clear example to me of what vulnerable narcissism looks like. In 2014, he took his grievances to the streets of Isla Vista, California, armed with knives, guns, and a seething hatred for the women who had, in his mind, denied him of his birthright: sex, love, and power. He murdered 6 people, injured 14 more, and left behind a 141-page manifesto dripping with entitlement and self-pity. To incels, he's a legend. To the rest of the world, he's a grim warning on the very real, very toxic FAFO effects of the patriarchy's lies soak into these male counterparts who remain unwantedly celibate. Let's take a closer look at Trey and the timeline of events that occurred which would end up uncovering a planned mass shooting. Trey, who is currently 25 years old, admittedly began on his journey around January of 2019. During this time, Genco purchased tactical gloves, a bulletproof vest, a hoodie with the word revenge written on it, cargo pants, a Bowie knife, and a skull face mask. The next month, February, he purchased a rifle. On May 20th, 2019, Gray purchased 2 factory Glock 17 magazines, a 9mm Glock 17 clip, and a concealed carry holster clip for a Glock firearm. Gray began actively participating in an online incel forum, posting over 450 times. In these posts, he expressed deep-seated anger towards women and admiration for Elliot Rodger. As I stated before, Roger is a figure idolized within the incel community for his attack. Trey himself had detailed an incident on July 24th, 2019, which was Elliot Rogers' birthday, don't you know, where he sprayed women and couples with orange juice, mirroring Rogers' actions, going so far as to describe this act as, quote, extremely empowering, unquote, and that he felt, quote, spiritually connected, unquote, to Roger, suggesting that all incels should try this act as it is cathartic. Between July 30th, 2019 and August 15th, 2019, Genco wrote a note that referenced an Ohio State College to be exact. The note included the following information. Quote, May 23rd, 2020, 290 days. M16 optional, covert or mil spec. Will get arms training in BCT, Georgia. KC needs to be huge. 3,000? Aim big then. KC stands for kill count and is often associated with both so-called incel saints Alex Manassian and Elliot Roger. On August 3rd, 2019, Genco wrote a document entitled, quote, A Hideous Symphony, a manifesto written by Tres Genko, the socially exiled incel, end quote. The note discusses obtaining United States Army training, stating that, quote, this training will be for the attainment of one reality, the death of what I have been deprived most, but also cherish and fantasize at the opportunity of having, but has been neglected of, women. I will slaughter out of hatred, jealousy, and revenge. End quote. Trey referred to death as the great equalizer. Also on August 3rd, Genco conducted online searches for sororities and Ohio State University. He researched gun modifications that same month and saved illustrated guides for the construction of M16s. He searched the internet for topics including, quote, Elliot Rogers, end quote, difference between full automatic and semi-automatic, end quote, homemade flashbang, end quote, and finally, quote, how many days left until May 23rd, end quote. He then left for the United States Army and began basic training on August 20th, 2019. So it seems as though old Trey wanted to train up his abilities. Not for self-improvement or anything like that, no, but to murder women. He would have you believe that he specifically joined the army so that he could become the best hunter, the best murderer, even though his mom admitted to pressuring him to enlist, since he didn't seem to have any aspirations or goals in his life. He wanted to outdo Elliot Roger for whatever reason. He also seemed desperate to be recognized for something, anything. He wanted the infamy, it seemed, and it suited him to revisionize all that rather than admitting that he really went into the army because of his mom. And hey, the road towards infamy and attributing his incel hero could come along with a gun, a uniform, and a rank. Why not? The U.S. Army gave him structure, discipline, and a sense of purpose until they didn't. Trey was discharged for entry-level performance and conduct on December 18th, 2019. In other words, he couldn't cut it. He lasted about 5 months. Back home in Ohio, he was just plain old Trey again. No more mission to be completed, no more brotherhood and camaraderie of the army. Just a guy sitting alone in his bedroom, stewing in his own insignificance. And so, he turned back to the internet's built-in support group of incel forums, where violence is prophecy. He wasn't just another nameless ghost scrolling the forums, no. Trey wanted to be someone. I mean, he wrote a manifesto. He obsessed over Elliot Roger like a disciple clinging to scripture, even trying to mimic his theateresque, word salady style of writing. On January 11th, 2020, after returning to Ohio, Genco created a document that he titled Isolated, which includes the following statements. Quote, "If you're reading this, I've done something horrible. Somehow, you've come across the writings of the deluded and the homicidal. Not an easy task, and for that I congratulate you. Your curiosity and willingness to delve into such a dark topic." End quote. He signed the note, quote, "Your hopeful friend and murderer." End quote. Around January 15th, 2020, Genco conducted internet searches for topics that included, quote, "planning a shooting crime," end quote, and, quote, "when does preparing for a crime become an attempt," end quote. And one can see what he's thinking through his actions. He is probably thinking something along the lines of, like a good soldier, I'll come prepared. Because he had already bought weapons, and he conducted reconnaissance at Ohio State University that same week. He studied tactical strategies to make his attack as deadly as possible. On March 11th, 2020, Trey conducted an internet search of police scanner codes for Columbus, Ohio, and university police agencies. He'd begun planning this mission to murder women just as his idol had. The difference between Trey and his idol Elliot, though, is that Trey gets caught before he could immortalize himself in the Incel Hall of Infamy. The following day, March 12th, 2020, after the internet searches of police scanner codes, Genco was arrested following a tense, chaotic situation at his home. He was taken into custody, and he consented to a search of his vehicle. Law enforcement were responding to a call from his mom, who had become concerned about her son's erratic behavior and a possible threat involving a firearm. When the officers arrived, they encountered Genco, who initially denied having a weapon at all, but later admitted that he did. The search for the weapon led officers to his vehicle, where they uncovered not just one firearm, also body armor, a rifle, and numerous rounds of ammunition. To be exact, agents located the following items in the trunk of his car: an AR-15 style rifle with a suspected bump stock attached, several loaded magazines, body armor, and boxes of ammunition. An additional handgun was later found in the heating vent of Genco's bedroom. Genco's mother, visibly alarmed, told the police that her son's behavior had become increasingly erratic, noting disturbing changes since his time in the military. COVID had also just become a nationwide panic in the United States. Trey's mom had discovered documents in his room, one of which described the desire to harm multiple people, which is what I read earlier about the kill count being 3,000, aim big, remember? Yeah. In the following days, Genco was formally charged. He was indicted officially on July 20th, 2021. The indictment raised serious concerns, leading Trey to file multiple motions, including one to suppress the evidence gathered from a warrantless search of his bedroom, arguing that it violated his Fourth Amendment rights. A suppression hearing was held on October 20th, 2021, during which Detective Erica Engel testified about the search of Genco's bedroom. The officers had been looking for firearms, and while Genco initially consented to the search, the investigation extended beyond the agreed scope when Detective Engel read a note found during the search. Genco argued that the reading of this document was an overreach, a violation of his consent, and the court agreed, partially granting his motion to suppress evidence found in his bedroom. The motion hearings, filing delays, and suppression decisions set the stage for a lengthy and contentious legal battle, culminating in Trey's sentencing. His defense team worked to frame his actions as a product of a severe psychological shift, which they attributed to his time in the military. However, the prosecution emphasized the severity of the weapons found, his erratic behavior, and the chilling nature of the documents discovered in his possession, which indicated premeditated violent intent. Ultimately, the court recognized the complexity of Genko's case, acknowledging the need for a nuanced approach, one that balanced his mental health history with the threat that he posed by his actions. In the end, the court's decision was a sentence of 17 months in October of 2020 for his terroristic threat towards women. Credit, of course, of time served for the 224 days he'd already been in custody. Just after the new year of 2021, Trey was assigned to a halfway house to begin integrating back into the likes of society. Instagram posts made after he was in the halfway house seemed to show a change of thinking, even admitting in one post that, quote, I need to learn how to move the fuck on, unquote. It seemed as though Trey's time spent in jail may have helped untangle his brain from this ideological way of thinking. Too bad for him, though, that the law was not done with him, because during this exact time, federal agents were building a case to indict Trey for hate crimes against women. This could only be done at the federal level, so it took some time. Trey was arrested by the feds in July 2021. In October of 2022, Trey pled guilty to one count of attempting to commit a hate crime and was sentenced on February 29th, 2024 to 80 months in prison, about 6 years in total. I guess we will see what is to come at his release. The sentence was harsh, reflecting both the potential danger he represented and the concern for public safety. The way that this case was prosecuted was kind of the first of its kind. The court's approach underscored the importance of thorough investigation and legal procedure, especially when constitutional rights and personal freedoms of women were at stake. U.S. Attorney Kenneth L. Parker said in a statement that, quote, Genco intended to carry out a devastating mass murder of innocent women in this state for no other reason than the fact that he hated them. Everybody deserves to live without threats of violence or fearing acts of terror, end quote. So how do we even attempt to really acknowledge this situation? We spent this entire episode peeling back the layers of how and why this behavior manifests from under the manosphere umbrella, branching off, of course, into the incel community. There's been a tendency to frame incel violence as a product of individual pathology, that is, mental illness, loneliness, or personal dysfunction. And while these factors may be present, they're not the cause. The idea that someone commits an act of gendered violence because they're depressed, autistic, or socially isolated is both inaccurate and dangerous. It shifts the blame away from the real issue at heart here, the root of the problem, a cultural and social structure that normalizes male supremacy and female subjugation. The evolutionary psychological approach often tells us that men resort to violence due to deep-seated biological impulses, competition, rejection sensitivity, or sexual frustration. But that too falls short. Not all men who struggle with loneliness or rejection turn to violence. The difference, in my opinion, is ideology. And this is where the feminist framework comes in. If we analyze incel violence through a feminist lens, we see them not as a collection of broken individuals, but as a symptom of a larger misogynistic system, a system that teaches men to believe that they are owed access to women for any reason and that rejection is an injustice. And instead of excusing or sensationalizing inceldom By asking what's wrong with these men, we should be asking questions like what social conditions and narratives keep fostering this rage? Oh, how do we identify when someone might be slipping into these dangerous ideologies? Well, researchers have pointed to the triad of risk for incels, which include personal crisis or instability, meaning job loss, a breakup, or personal trauma that leaves someone feeling powerless. The second part of the triad of risk for incels would be online radicalization. Duh, right? As we discussed, this happens in the digital spaces of the manosphere where the likes of Andrew Tate and other toxic manfluencers can be found. And finally, the third part of the triad of risk for incels is access to violent means. Whether this is weapons, explicit plans, or escalating rhetoric, it's when ideology turns to action, especially if you see someone researching mass shootings or something along those lines. It can be an indication of deteriorating mental health or even the planning of an extreme attack. If we as a society are going to be serious about preventing incel violence, we need to stop excusing it as a mental health crisis or even an evolutionary inevitability. Because to me, it's about how misogyny is reinforced and weaponized, both in these parts of the internet and also in the casual conversations that we let slide. And speaking of conversations, the TV show Adolescence has done something that few mainstream narratives dare to do. By taking this crisis of angry, sometimes very young men who feel left outside of society for whatever reason, and putting it in front of us in a way that people can talk about it. Do you have any thoughts or opinions about this episode? If you do, I'd love to read them in the comments section. I hope you'll join me next time on Great in the Sack when misogyny leads to mayhem. Until then, stay vigilant, stay vocal, because silence is complicity. Oh, and please, please, please don't forget to like and follow the podcast anywhere you listen to your podcasts. You can also find me on Instagram under Great in the Sack True Crime Podcast. And you can reach me on email at freightinthesackpodcast@gmail.com. We'll see you next time in the sack. Thanks for listening.